Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about aesthetics and politics. I don't like to use this phrase very often, but this episode sort of broke my brain a little bit. I am joined by the architect, author, and educator Mark Foster Gage. Mark is currently an assistant dean at the Yale School of Architecture and edited a brand new book that just came out called Aesthetics Equals Politics. And as I was reading the essays in the book, I was struck by how my understanding of and definitions for aesthetics suddenly felt dated or inaccurate or somehow limiting. And so I wanted to have Mark on the show to talk about aesthetics, and that's what this episode is all about. We talk about the evolutions of aesthetics theory and how it's more than just how something looks in that sort of Kantian sense. Aesthetics, as Mark describes in the book, is a basis for human activity. And we use this definition to try to reframe how we talk about aesthetics and how this changes the way designers can think about how they work. We also talk about Mark's own background studying classical architecture and his early interest in philosophy and the problems that come with this kind of post-rationalization of the narratives around our work. This is a very deep philosophical conversation, and I'm honestly still wrapping my head around a lot of it, but I think it's just a great episode. And if you're interested like me in this intersection between theory and practice or philosophy and design, Aesthetics Equals Politics is a great book to spend time with. And I hope that this conversation that you're about to hear is a great introduction to the argument that Mark puts forward in the book. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that features behind-the-scenes content, links and articles from former guests about design and writing and criticism and all the things that we talk about on the show, and as well as previews of upcoming episodes and future guests. Scratching the Surface is fully supported through these memberships. So if you would like to help with the ongoing production of the podcast, I hope that you consider joining. Thank you, as always, for listening. And here is me talking with Mark Foster Gage. I'd like to talk about the new book, but before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about your background and your career, because you, as I've been spending time with your work over the last couple weeks or so preparing for this and thinking about this, you have a career that I think relates to a lot of the themes of the podcast. And so I kind of want to talk about how you kind of got into all of this. And so you originally studied both architecture and art history at Notre Dame?
Yes.
So can you talk about, I know it's like weird kind of in retrospect to talk about what you were thinking at the time, but what were your interests then when you were in school? What kind of career were you imagining for yourself?
That is a tough one. So I was in architecture and got a second major in art history at Notre Dame, and it started out in architecture. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but Notre Dame was then and still is a completely classical architecture school, totally
interesting.
dedicated to, I spent in my undergraduate, my first 3 studios were a semester on the Doric, a semester on the Ionic, and a semester on the Corinthian.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And when I graduated, I came out during spring break to New York because I wanted to be in New York, and interviewed at a bunch of classical firms and also interviewed with Robert A. M. Stern Architects. And I went back and told one of my professors that I had been offered a job at Robert A. M. Stern Architects. And I had accepted because I was proud. He was well known.
Yeah.
And my professor said, "Robert A. M. Stern, why would you want to work for that modernist?" I said, "Why would you want to work for that modernist?" Because Notre Dame is like so conservative that Bob Stern's seen as like being this radical heresy. And the reason I wanted to get an art history education as well was because very early on, I realized that the education I was getting at Notre Dame was really strong, foundationally, really unusual. Really, we didn't in our history classes cover anything after, 1899.
Yeah.
So I knew that I was missing something. So I decided to kind of go to the next, I don't know, maybe the closest thing to architecture, which was art and art history, and you couldn't take two studio degrees at the same time because you don't have time to do art studio,
Right. Right.
architecture studio. But I found out that I could get an art history degree, basically double major, by packing my electives full and taking extras, and I focused my art history education on 20th century stuff because I
Okay.
wasn't getting it in.
Right. Right.
So my undergraduate thesis was called Seriality and Gravity in the Work of Jackson Pollock, and it was about when he
Mm,
returned to figuration after his abstract
right.
expressionism, and that was like. 1956 is about as far as my education went. But when I graduated, it was funny. Like I didn't know, I'd never heard of like Frank Gehry. I didn't know who any of these people
That's
were.
so interesting. Yeah. So was the I have two questions that may or may not be related. Did you see that art history degree as something that was in service of the architecture degree? Were you still very much interested in being an architect, I guess? And then the kind of related question is, being in a classical program, was that your interest in architecture, I guess, or were you why were you craving that modernism?
I went to Notre Dame like a lot of people because it was the best school I got into, got good financial aid. But I honestly didn't know. I had only become interested in architecture in my humanities class in high school, and we spent a third of the semester on music, a third on art, and a third on architecture. And I was like, wow, architecture is really interesting. And so I just put it down as my possible major when I applied to schools. And then I got into Notre Dame and just started taking architecture classes. And I had no idea it was a classical architecture program. But I got into it and I was like, wow, this is really like interesting. And I gotta say, I've been teaching at Yale for 18 years, and Yale's model is predicated on people from all sorts of different places arguing, and kind of pluralism, like abject pluralism. Uh, and Notre Dame was the opposite. It was like everybody focused on one goal, like reintroducing the
Mm,
architecture of antiquity like back into the world, and that was. I don't know. It kind of felt a little bit like you were part of the Rebel Alliance or something.
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you're part of something, and that appealed to me. But what also appealed to me is that it was so unbelievably rigorous. Like classical
Mm,
architecture is something that you can be innovative with, but not unless you know the rules. And there's very strict
right.
rules, so it's like chess. Like classical architecture
Right.
is like chess. You can make these moves, but you really have to calculate how they're going to impact, because it's all based on algorithms and proportions. If you change a metapede distance, that changes the whole facade in some ways. There's things that have to line up. There's things that don't have to line up. There's proportional rules, and the more you learn about it, the better you get. The better you get, the more heretical you can get while still playing inside the rules. And that always, I don't know, that was always my comfort zone, was like pushing the rules as much as I could. I remember I got in trouble during my senior thesis, my fifth year thesis, because I had windows stacked on top of each other, and I had a window lintel that was the sill of the one above it. So this
Mm,
piece of
mm.
stone was doubling as a window sill and a lintel. And it was like, oh my God, you can't do that. Like, yeah,
Right.
everything in classical architecture has one function, and you're doubling up on
Right.
functions. And I was talking about like I was reading theory on my own. I was reading linguistic theory and Ferdinand de Saussure, and I'm talking about these theoretical ideas and how this lintel has two meanings. And I'm sure it was the most ridiculous thing, but in retrospect, I was just like trying to find an intellectual basis for my work, and that was something that wasn't really, I would say, a strong aspect of the program in architecture, but it was entirely the program of art history. So I got the intellectual, let's say, fortitude from art history because, especially the stuff I was studying, mid 20th century work, it's not about manual dexterity and skill at all. It's about
Right.
ideas and kind of cultural movements that propelled the art. So when Jackson Pollock is doing, painting, it's not about classical proportions. It's the opposite of that. So I was kind of like trying to get the alpha in the omega.
You started answering exactly what my next question was going to be, because I feel like so much of your work is also, it's not just in practicing architecture, but it's also in theory and writing. And I was curious when that came in. And so you mentioned that you got a lot of that from art history, but you're also reading a lot of theory on your own. Where'd that interest come from, or how did that start to filter into these, kind of other studies
Yeah, I
that you
would
were
say
doing?
two moments. One moment is I was a sophomore, and Notre Dame has a really great, architectural library, but it's super
Mm,
duper like classically oriented. So
right.
you would go in, and you know how librarians in architecture libraries all around the world, they put like the new books up on the new bookshelf,
Right.
and you would look on this new book shelf, and it would be like insights into the Doric order. Like in
Yeah.
other schools, it's
Yeah.
like Frank Gehry's new monograph. Zaha
Right.
Hadid's like new little book, or when she before she
That's
was
so interesting.
Notre Dame's.
Yeah.
It was like like an analysis of the metapiece of the Parthenon.
Hmm. Hmm.
So the new book section was kind of like funny at the time, like really. But there was this one book I saw, and it was a book by AD, and it was called Reconstruction Deconstruction. My ideology is better than yours, and it was Leon Creer versus Peter Eisenman. And Leon
Okay.
Creer, for if your viewers don't know, is like the founding father of new urbanism and all about traditional cities and really vernacular solid stone buildings.
Hmm.
He's a great architect. I've actually taught a studio with him since, which is a little bit ironic.
Oh,
Um,
nice. Yeah.
but and then the other half of the book was Peter Eisenman, and we didn't have any Peter Eisenman books in our library, but I feel like this one slipped under their radar because it had Leon Creer on it. So I started
Hmm.
reading these debates between Leon Creer and Peter Eisenman, and I was like, oh my God, this is fascinating. Like I knew all the Creer stuff by heart. But the Peter Eisenman
Right.
stuff is like radical architectural thinker at the time, talking about the value of heterotopia and difference and la difference and Derrida and deconstruction. And I was like, oh my God, like I had no idea any of this. So our
Yeah.
program at the time was for a church. I think it was like, the Ionic semester or whatever. And at Notre Dame being a Catholic school, like I would say every other
Yeah.
studio we did was a church or a chapel, but like
Right.
I got as radical as I could on that church,
Okay.
and really like it ended up being like a Catholic, cathedral, but like the most radical I could do was in the style of Gaudi. So
Okay.
I
Yeah.
did this Gaudi church, and I was throwing all these theory ideas from Peter Eisenman at the jury, and they were like, "This kid is nuts!" Like, so that was one moment where I was like, "Wow, this is really exciting to use my mind in this way, and to be a kind of
Yeah.
enfant terrible in the school and push people's buttons." And then the second moment was in we all study for a year in Rome as part of our
Okay.
5 year program. We spent our third year in Rome, and we had a visiting architectural theory professor named Branko Mitrovic, who's still a friend of mine. He teaches in Norway. And he introduced us to Kant and
Hmm.
ideas of
Okay.
aesthetics. And the idea that really like launched my interest in aesthetics, which I think is going to be part of the conversation where we
Yeah.
continue to
Yeah.
go, was this idea in Kant called subsummation or
Hmm.
subsumen in German, in which you subsume something under a concept. And what Kant was basically saying was if you look at a vase, you make an aesthetic judgment about that vase, whether it's beautiful or ugly, before you recognize it as a vase. And
Right.
once you recognize it as a vase and give it the name vase and understand it as a function of holding water, and you like make it a linguistic word in your mind, and you apply the function to it, and you know everything about a vase, and you have expectations of it, then you're no longer capable of making uh, aesthetic judgments about a thing.
Right.
That
Right.
resonated very strongly with something I had learned in art history, which was when I was studying the work of Francis Bacon. Um, and he has this idea that his painting was supposed to work directly on the nervous system. And he said this as a quote, and it basically like skips the brain and works
Mm.
directly on the nervous system. And this is the same exact idea of aesthetics that Kant was in his writing. So it was like, wow, this is super interesting. there's this way of influencing people with architecture that doesn't have to do with narrative and like symbolism and bullshit, to be honest, saying I was inspired by this bird, here's my building, it's a bird, like, but there's this other way that we impact culture and humanity through aesthetics that doesn't have anything to do with the bullshit that we apply to our buildings, but that our buildings work directly on the nervous system. And that idea was what got my interest in aesthetics going. And I had, spent from 1995 until 2008 more as like a hobby when I was working and going to school because nobody at the time was writing about aesthetics. The only book you could get was Dave Hickey's Invisible Dragon, which was like, you know, now it's like $600 on eBay, But there was no nourishment for that. There was no one teaching it at Yale when I went. There was no one teaching at Notre Dame. There was nothing. There's no architectural books on the subject. So eventually I did a book on the subject and edited a compendium of aesthetic theory essays, mostly just as my own research. Like it was just me learning about the subject because it wasn't in the profession. And I did that mostly in 2008. It was published in 2012, 10, I think. And right around that time, come around 2012, aesthetic starts to become a really interesting subject in philosophy. And by 2015, it's back in architectural discourse. And, I just feel like I kind of Forrest Gumped my way into this, you know, contemporary discourse in philosophy and architecture because I was the only person studying it, not because I had any particular virtuosity with the subject matter. But I was like the only guy in architecture who was serious about aesthetics, and now I've kind of become a poster child for the discourse in the profession.
So can you? I mean, I think you're right. This is a good way that we can start kind of talking about the new book. And I have a couple, just so you know, I do have some questions about your larger work. But I think while we're talking about aesthetics, we can talk about the book. And something that's, what was interesting to me about reading the new book is I was starting to question the definitions of aesthetics that I had always thought or that I had always been given. Could you define or describe what you mean when you say aesthetics?
Yeah, yeah. Like this is going to be like a 4-hour podcast, I'm sure. But no,
Okay.
that's
If you have
that's
time, I have
no,
time.
that's really like the entire point of the book is that in
Yeah.
philosophy, aesthetics is being reevaluated as a branch of philosophy that doesn't only govern what it has in the past. So most people's common conception of aesthetics is really the definition that comes from the movement of aestheticism, of which like
Hmm.
Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater were kind of the primary figures, and aesthetics in that movement were defined as basically like all art is quite useless, and aesthetics was about art, and it was a way
Right.
to separate art from the kind of vulgarities of economic marketplace culture. So Oscar
Hmm.
Wilde's efforts to say all art is quite useless wasn't a blasé attitude. It was a very strategic way to say you're not getting your hands on art capitalism.
Right. I
It was a
see.
reaction against that, and so that's good in one way. It's saved art, in some circles from the kind of vulgarities of just being another product. But at the same time, it turned aesthetics into this useless thing. And you
Right.
only talk about aesthetics if you're going to talk about something is beautiful or ugly. And if you have the time to talk about beautiful things and ugly things, you're clearly an elite, person within the world to have all this time to talk about beautiful and ugliness. So aesthetics for most of the 20th century was dismissed as this useless discourse about beauty and ugliness. And even worse, it was elitist because if you have, again, time to talk about beauty, then you're not talking about the real things that matter in the world, which are social ideas and cultural ideas and ideas about equality
Right.
and what's under the structures of the world and hierarchies that are keeping us down. So aesthetics was dismissed for over 100 years for this reason because it was seen as the frivolous pursuit as the beautiful and the ugly. And I would say 99 out of 100 people you ask on the sidewalk what aesthetics is, they're going to say, oh, it's whether things are beautiful or ugly. Now,
Yeah.
that's significantly outdated 18th century way of thinking about aesthetics as a branch of philosophy. Aesthetics today within philosophy is defined in a very different way, and a very different way by very different people. But I would say one of the best definitions is, I think, my in the book, Timothy Morton, who's a friend of mine and really important in particular as a philosopher within the environmental philosophy discourses, uh, really kind of defines reality as things like in kind of moving around and brushing up against one another, but you can't ever fully experience another thing. Like you can never exhaust its qualities. Like I can taste an apple and see that it's red, but there's a lot of aspects of appleness that I don't have access to.
Mm,
But you know, we brush
hmm
up against apples and we eat them, but we don't fully experience them. And then that's like that brushing up things of against each other, and the capacity for change, the capacity for people to brush up against each other and experience aspects of each other without ever fully understanding each other. That's like that's how change happens, you know, by
right.
objects and things and people brushing up against each other and producing new directions for reality. And that is how, you know, he defines the aesthetic dimension. And that is aesthetics, that ether in which we're all bumping around and coming into contact and slightly experiencing one another and instigating change in other areas, that liquid that we're all swimming in, that is aesthetics. So, aesthetics in philosopher Graham Harman's vocabulary is therefore first philosophy, which is, you know, the philosophy that actually governs our understanding of reality. And that's very different than the frivolous philosophy of beauty and ugliness. Instead, it's being reconsidered as the philosophy of like how we sense the world around us. And the only reason why
Yeah.
that's possible now, and it wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago, is because within philosophy, philosophy for the 20th century has been dominated um, by the discourse of idealism as opposed to the discourses of realism. And this is a really
Mm-hmm.
easy divide, but in the discourses of idealism, things are only real as they're perceived to your mind. So, for instance, Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. What he's
Right.
saying is, I don't exist unless I think that I exist. So, for instance, the computer I'm in front of isn't real until it's processed by my mind as a computer.
Right.
So, realism is the opposite instead of that. Realism is saying a computer it exists outside my mind as an independent thing, whether or not I perceive it. So, only within the last 10 years within philosophy has realism started to be taken seriously once again, which means aesthetics as the discourse of the real and sensible information and the way we touch and see and understand the world through our senses is only possible within a world of realism, because if everything is in the world of idealism where you're only processing things in your mind, then things like touch, sight, smell are all just fictions, because the true reality is how those things are perceived in the mind. So aesthetics was off the table largely because philosophy was dominated by idealism. The other aspect of that is philosophy was also dominated by what's called correlationism. So things are really understood as part of their relationships with other things. And
Mm,
Deleuze was a big figure in this. He would
right.
say a water bottle isn't actually an object, it's actually some chemicals that were once sand and gasoline and they were treated and now they're a water bottle, and then they're going to go to a landfill and degrade and become some other form of chemical. So you taking a snapshot of it right now and calling it a water bottle is actually a lie. It's actually always in the process of becoming something else.
Oh, I see.
So objects and realism says, nope, this is actually a water bottle. It may become something else later. It may have been something before, but right now it's a water bottle, and it has qualities that I
Right.
can sense. I can see it. I can touch it. I know its weight. I'm holding one here in front of me. I can understand that it's supposed to hold liquid. I know how long it's going to last me. There's a lot of things I sense and understand with my sensory apparatus as a human about this water bottle. Um, but what's interesting about the water bottle is that there's also a lot of things that my sensory apparatus doesn't understand. For instance, my
Hmm.
dog is sitting here right next to me, Truman, and he may smell aspects of the water bottle that I don't smell. And
Right.
water bottle has, plastic and therefore carbon, and carbon is only formed in the supernova explosions of dying stars. So that means at some point between 4 billion and 13 billion years ago, some carbon landed on this planet and somehow got into this water bottle. I'll never know the journey of that carbon. But what's interesting about the one of the discourses featured in the book is object-oriented ontology. Is
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
largely
yeah.
about that objects have qualities, but humans are never able to exhaust all of those qualities, and that's only
Okay.
possible because philosophy has started to toy around with the idea that objects actually exist in reality, not just in the mind. So it's like a falling domino effect. If philosophy starts to move from idealism to realism, then aesthetics is once again possible to look at as a discourse. And if aesthetics is once
Right.
again possible to look at as a discourse, how would we rethink that today in within the new ways people are thinking about realism? And one of the key moments of that was in 2008. There was a symposium called Speculative Realism, which was basically a group of philosophers in England that got together. One of which was Graham Harman, who's kind of been the probably most
Hmm.
his work has gotten the most traction from those groups. But speculative realism, it was
Right.
speculations on what realism can do in philosophy. So it's no accident that it took like 4 or 5 years for even that work to find its way into architecture. Now, this answer is going on too long, but obviously, like once architecture gets wind of a philosophy that has to do with aesthetics, architects are like, even if you think aesthetics is only about beautiful and ugliness, like architects are like, wait a minute, like they're talking about aesthetics again. We can do aesthetics. Like everything we do is aesthetics. We talk about aesthetics all the time. We just don't do it very well and with up to date information. So, thus, my interest in forming relationships with these philosophers and really getting to know them personally, and bringing them into the world
Yeah.
of architecture. So, like next semester, I'm teaching a studio with Graham Harman at Yale, and it'll be the first time a non-architect is a visiting professor in our school's 100-year history. So that's kind of interesting. So we're trying to form new alliances, but then again, it's not new because Peter Eisenman was doing collaborations with Jacques Derrida in the 80s, and
Right. Right.
Brunelleschi in 1420 was doing collaborations intellectually with Leon Battista Alberti. So there's a history of like intellectuals and architects collaborating to move both of their industries in new ways. And I think what we're doing with aesthetics is just the latest in that kind of historic trajectory of collaborations across industries that propel architecture in new directions.
Yeah, I mean that was such a I feel like I have like 50 questions. You're right. This could be a 4-hour podcast now.
People love
um,
4 hour podcasts. People have so much time these days. They just
yeah, yeah. Uh, something I'm thinking about, when you were talking about this is in graphic design, um, aesthetics is often, like you said, used as beautiful or ugly, but is kind of shorthanded as the surface level of something, just the way the thing
yeah,
looks. That's that's the aesthetics, but then it means something else, or it's about something else. And when I talk about design criticism and kind of how we talk about or write about design and architecture, I often find myself saying um, that I want to see graphic design criticism, especially, be less focused on the aesthetics. And when I say that, I mean less focused on how it
yeah,
looks. Because a lot of graphic design writing is about, oh, they use these typefaces or these colors, or, they modernized it by softening the curve on this letter form, or something like that. And I will refer to that as like, you know, semi-Kantian aesthetic
yeah,
judgment. And I want to move towards something about, well, how does this piece of design function in the world? That's the type of criticism that I'm interested in. But when I was reading the book and hearing you answer that last question, that division starts to fall apart a little bit for me. And there's another definition in the book, and I can't remember if this was yours or if this was someone else calling aesthetics just the basis for human activity, which is kind of what you were just
Yeah.
saying. And so I guess the question that I'm asking is, how do we move beyond thinking about aesthetics as the surface layer, the decoration, the thing that just is added on at the end, but is actually core to all of this,
Yeah.
really? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I sort of ironically, and what this book is largely against is this idea that there is a surface of things and then there's like the real truth underneath. Right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that's an idea that doesn't come from aesthetics. That's an idea that comes from critical theory. And that's critical theory with a
Mm-hmm.
capital C, capital T. And that emerges from the Frankfurt School in the
Yeah,
early
yeah, yeah.
20th century with, Horkheimer and Adorno. And basically,
Right,
these
right.
guys were essentially Marxists after kind of Marxism had fallen out of favor, but they introduced into the world this concept of critical theory and like critical reading. And what they
Right.
meant was regular people, as Marxism may or may not have shown, like don't have the ability to see the truth of things. It's only intellectuals that can see the truth of things. So the Frankfurt School really introduced this idea into academic culture that being critical, like being having a critical eye and being able to
Yeah.
see through the bullshit and see the real truth of the thing. Like that's what you go to school for, and that's like this serious business in which we're all engaged. And what they used is aesthetics as almost like the slur to describe
Right,
the
right, right.
first
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
layer of things. And that makes sense because to them, aesthetics was whether or not things were only beautiful or ugly. So on one side, you have the old version of aesthetics, which is if things are beautiful or ugly. And people are like, we need a name for this totally useless surface layer that we see covering up the truth of everything. Let's call that aesthetics. That was what happened in the Frankfurt School, and
Right.
that's why still today people in universities talk about like, oh, I have a you have to be able to critically read something or critically look at it.
Right.
That's a descendant of the Frankfurt School, and people don't know that. Like, it's just a holdover because every generation of academics for the last 5 generations has been educated with this idea. So people use the term critical without even knowing its roots anymore. Um, and that's why, we just had well, I mean, it's not recent, but an architecture biennale in, I think it was like 2000, that was curated by Massimilio Fuchses. And the title of it was Less Aesthetics, More Ethics. And I
Oh,
remember
yeah,
being
yeah.
really pissed off about that as early as 2000 because I had been reading everyone from, Aristotle to Susan Sontag and understanding that the aesthetics have a super political dimension and may actually be the dimension in which all politics takes place. And that's what the
Right,
philosopher
right.
Jacques Rancière, who's also in the book, writes about
Yeah,
almost
yeah, yeah.
exclusively, is that what you mentioned graphic design is that for the one reading, aesthetics is, oh, it's just the fact that this book is green and red and uses Helvetica and appeals to the eye,
Yeah.
and just like, but
Right,
under
right.
that, like, oh, there's the truth of how this book, functions in the world. So that's one reading of aesthetics, that it's just the colors and pretty shapes. The other is, as Timothy Morton describes it, is aesthetics is the discourse, that is to say, how we talk about the way that book moves through the world, the way it brushes up against its author who writes it, the way that material
Mm-hmm.
that's written by the author brushes up against the graphic designer who has an impact on it, and how that brushes up against the publisher who changes it in a certain way, and how that brushes up against the bookseller who displays it in a certain way, and how that brushes up against the person who buys it, and that book
Mm.
has a different meaning to these different people or appeals to a different sense or One of them buys it because they like pink. One of them buys it because they're deeply interested in the intellectual theories, displayed in the book. So the book bumps up against those people in new ways. But that book, whether it's being brushed up against the graphic designer, the publisher, the bookseller, the buyer, the buyer's child who picks it up and flips through it but doesn't read it, that book is bouncing around the world and impacting people in different ways. It does that in the
Right.
aesthetic dimension because causality, that is to say, change, can only happen in the real world. That is the real world of aesthetics. And aesthetics is just,
Right.
aesthetics isn't a thing, aesthetics is the discourse that just best describes
I
how we talk
Yeah, yeah,
about
yeah, yeah.
how those things bounce around in the world. So aesthetics has gone from being like the unwanted redheaded stepchild of philosophy to being like the ether in which all philosophy now takes place.
It's going to take me a bit to wrap my head around that. Around
Yeah,
that,
and
it's
what
so
what's
interesting
interesting
to
is
me.
that is, and even the term aesthetics is really an 18th century term popularized by Kant but invented by this guy Baumgartner. But these aesthetic ideas, you know, are found as far back in Plato and his references to Socrates, that Aristotle talks about a certain vibrancy of seeing. There's all these descriptions of what we would now call aesthetics in the history of intellectual thought. It's just it didn't have a name.
So how, I don't want to say this like new definition of aesthetics, but this kind of larger, more encompassing definition of aesthetics. What does that mean for the architect, for the designer? Does that change how they work or think about their work, or should it?
Yeah, I mean, let's just think about, like, okay, so you're in Brooklyn, I'm in Manhattan. Let's just pick something in between us. Let's pick like the World Trade Center. And
Okay.
so at the World Trade Center, the world famous architect Santiago Calatrava just built a $4 billion, subway transit building, the white, kind of
Mhm.
spiky one. And
Yeah.
his entire narrative for that project, the reason it looks the way it is because he said it was um, supposed to look like a dove being released from the hands of a child. Okay,
Mm.
so I'm just going to give like your
Right.
audience just a little moment to like swallow the small bit of vomit which just crept up their throat, because that's like not, it's so like condescending and cheesy, but it's like that is the way architecture has functioned for the last, certainly the last, like, at least, I mean, in popular culture, last 20 years, that every architect has to give you an explanation about the brilliance behind their design and what inspired it and why it is the way it is. So you're supposed to
Right.
value
Right.
that building because it's about a child releasing a dove, and a dove is about peace, so the building is about peace, and everyone loves children and their innocence, and the building is innocent, and it's like you're supposed to see the birdness in the building. You're not supposed to see the building's qualities. You're supposed to see and understand its narrative. So architects have been trained to give
Mm.
people a narrative to accompany the physical thing that they're making. So some people do it through narrative. This building is a bird. Some people do it through diagrams. Like, so let's say the other, like, equidistant from me, I live on Mercer. Let's go like from 40 blocks south to 40 blocks north is, let's say, the kind of triangular building by Bjarke Ingels. So
Oh yeah.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
building, he doesn't give it a narrative that it's supposed to look like a bird, but he gives you a little diagram that says, like, if you push this corner down and pull this corner up with these
Right.
two big
Right.
bright green arrows, and you draw a picture of the sun and draw a picture of sunlight hitting one of the windows in the middle, that
Right.
you're just supposed to get it. Like, oh, this building looks the way it is because you got to get sun to this one window. So the idea is that you're not supposed to look at the building for its qualities. You're supposed to look at it, and understand, like, oh, it is the way it is because there's a scientific reason for it to get windows. So I call that an alibi. Like,
Right. Yeah. That's so
architects all need
interesting.
an alibi. An alibi in crime is like, oh, where were you when this crime was committed? So architects all today need an alibi for their building. Like, why does it look the way it looks? Like, what's the reason? You can't have just done this without a good reason. So the reason is either you're a genius and you're inspired by a bird, or you're, like so sensitive to the environment that you let the sun design the building and you had nothing to do with it. So you can't be blamed for its
Yeah.
aesthetic qualities, because no architect wants to be blamed for creating a willfully aesthetic object. So my hope in reintroducing aesthetic discourse is that we can once again talk about the qualities of buildings. That a building is rough, or it's smooth, or it's reflective, or it's not, or it's shiny, or it's matte finished, or it's gold, or it's red, or it looks heavy, or it looks
Hmm.
light. That these are the ways we sense buildings. These are the ways, like I described the book previously, that the owner, this building brushes up against the owner, against the tenants in a different way, against the people who walk by it and look at it, about the people who walk by and just touch it, about the people who see it in a postcard, against the people who see it on a bus. The building bounces around the aesthetic dimension and has different impacts on people. And every little impact is a moment of potential for something new to happen in the world. So let's say
Right.
mostly nothing new happens in the world. But if architecture can influence a new action within the world, that means it has political consequences, because a building can literally create change in some of these ways that it brushes up around and through the world. And I'd rather people look at and talk about how buildings bounce around the world and how their aesthetic qualities are what govern how it bounces around the world than talk
Okay.
about.
Yeah.
So that talks about it as an object, like an object independent of its relationships to birds or the sun, that it has its own qualities. So looking at a building aesthetically, uh, and thinking about how those aesthetic qualities are of political value as it enters the world is far more interesting than looking at a building and thinking it's only valuable because it looks like a bird and means freedom, as was the genius idea of the architect who wore the
I see.
cape and pulled the sheet off with a big flourish. That the
Right.
qualities,
Right.
the architectural qualities, are something we haven't talked about in 100 years, right?
And it's not just to look at those qualities to say this
No, it's
is
how
beautiful or ugly, but this is
this
how
is
it
how this thing
reacts to
reacts
things.
to things. This building is going to influence or impact a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and all of those influences happen because people perceive its aesthetic qualities in different ways. And not only
I see.
that, if you're a subscriber to, say, object oriented ontology, a building becomes even more interesting because the qualities that you can't sense are minute in comparison to the qualities that you can. So I think it was Thomas Edison who said we don't know 1 millionth of 1% about anything. That's true
Right.
with a
Yeah.
water bottle, and that's true with a building. But there's so many things that you don't understand about a building that uh, it makes buildings, once again, this is another aspect of the book, almost like kind of estranges them from reality a little bit. It makes them, especially if you strive to make them estranged from reality, that it actually heightens your awareness of the reality when a building somehow seems as if it doesn't fit into your current definition of what a building is. So buildings have the ability to raise your awareness about the reality you're perceiving. And that's a big theme in the book, and writings by people
Yeah.
like Michael Young and Jacques Rancière I have the dialogue with.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier about the kind of like the architect's alibi or the designer's alibi, this kind of explaining away or kind of creating narratives around everything. So it's not just this object. That's something, I think about that a lot. And I especially, I am probably guilty of it, honestly. And I'm especially guilty of it as a teacher with my students, of wanting them to have a reason for every decision, whether it's the typeface that they chose or what this color is. And it's not just you're just kind of going with you're not saying that the architect or the designer is just kind of going with their gut. There's like a middle ground, right? Am I
Oh yeah,
understanding that?
absolutely. That you want
Can you talk more
you want
about that, I
to
guess?
you want to anticipate like how you think this building will enter the world through its aesthetic qualities, or you want to
Okay, I see.
do something in a slightly different way that makes that allows people to get more curious about what it is that they're looking at. I mean, imagine, a building that doesn't fit your conventional notion of building. It generally raises someone's curiosity. Like, at least,
Hmm.
what the hell
Hmm.
is that? Like, why is that the way it is? Why is that so different than everything else? Like, it kind of is an invitation to curiosity. You know? And I think of the
Right.
value of curiosity in today's society because we have so little of it. We take a news bite that comes across Twitter and we believe it is true because it's from a
Right.
celebrity. But if we were more curious about where it came from or whether it's true or not or how it distorts the truth, if we had more curiosity and more kind of willingness to go deeper into things, I think we live in a much different world. But to go back to your original question about like why you require your students to have reasons, I'm going to make an assumption here that I've never been on a graphic design jury, but after a project, do you basically like have your students pin up a project and then a couple of graphic designers sit around and talk about it in front of the student?
Basically,
And the
yeah, yeah.
student has to say a couple words about their project before you guys open up and start dishing on it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that action, that format is a descendant of the École des Beaux-Arts, which was, essentially the most successful school of architecture over its 300-year history. It basically closed in 1968 when the world kind of shifted.
Okay.
But the idea originally was that the students all study under a master. So um, the great architects of New York City went to the École des Beaux-Arts. So, for instance, like Raymond Hood, who designed a lot of Rockefeller Center, a lot of,
Oh,
or
okay.
Corinne Hastings, who did, like the New York Public Library and Grand Central. These were all designed by
Mm-hmm.
architects who had gone to the École des Beaux-Arts. And the model of the École des Beaux-Arts is a master, a teacher who's an architect, takes on like 12 students for a semester. And then at the end, at the due date, they take their project, and all of the masters go into the back room and they pin up the projects and they would talk about them as faculty only. And they'd be like, oh, this person's project is a little bit
Mm.
too Greek. It should, whatever they say. And then they give it an
Right.
A, a
Right.
B, or C, or D, or whatever. So that format was imported into the United States through architecture schools, the first few of which are like Columbia, uh, by people who went to the École des Beaux-Arts. So they also imported the format of pinning up work and talking about it. But because
Right.
America
Huh.
was more democratic and equal, they let the students into the room. So now, all of a sudden, we've put this on the students the onus of having to talk about their projects before the faculty dish on them. So we make our students pin up and we make them say 3 minutes of stuff about their project before we say whether that before we talk about their project. So basically, what the world has done is created a situation in graphic design or in architecture where we're forcing the students to come up with at least 3 minutes of bullshit about their project, even if they have only have 30 seconds worth. And
Right. Right.
then
Right.
we're
Right.
forcing other critics to talk about the work. And the easiest way to talk about the work is to talk whether or not the bullshit the student said was true or not, or evident in the work. So a student will say, I did it because of the sun or to make it look like the bird. And the critics
Right.
will
Right.
say,
Yeah.
well, no, actually, it would work better if it went like this because the sun would hit it like this. Or it would look more bird like if you put a giant beak on it and painted it yellow. But we never talk
Right.
about, like, you know, the very notion of having to talk about it is part of the problem. So the format of architectural education is entirely predicated on a student talking about the work and then the critic talking about how the student talked about the work.
Right. And then both of those are, to kind of go back to your earlier point, are missing out on how does this thing live in the
Right.
world and rub up
We don't have a
against.
discourse in
Yeah.
architecture for talking about or anticipating
Right.
through the aesthetic dimension how this thing enters the world, like how
Yeah.
it might be
Yeah.
different for the owner or the tenant or the person who walks by, or how it bounces around the world and how it might impact the world, because that involves a little bit of fortune telling, right? And instead of
Yeah.
instead of being fortune tellers, we want to talk about like concrete things. And I know from experience, as a genius architect myself, that you could catch more sun if you pulled up this corner Or you could make it more bird-like if if you made the
Right.
shingles a different colors gray, because then they would all look more like feathers. Like so. I have to give you concrete information about your line of bullshit that you applied to this idea about a building that you're proposing would exist in the world, but we're not allowed to talk about how it might exist in the world because we don't have a tradition of talking about that and we don't know how to talk about it like that. So it's like
Right.
the world is being filled with these
Right.
architectural projects that have really shitty architectural qualities because nobody's willing to talk about them. But we have a lot of objects that have reasons for existing, like the zoning envelope is like this, or I lifted up the corner. So, I mean, most architecture buildings in New York City today will have a lifted up corner. It's just more or less
Mhm.
like the kind of default proposition in architecture. So, if you go to Alice Tully Hall by Diller and Scofidio, they have a lifted up corner
Oh
so you can
yeah.
see into the theater because we're revealing the truth of the theater. That's a critical
Right.
idea, and it's no accident that Liz and Rick, who are fantastic architects, I know Liz Diller a little bit, and I love their work, but their great patron was K. Michael Hayes, who's kind of the standard bearer for critical theory in architecture, and he gave them the solo show when he was the architectural curator at the Whitney, which really launched this most recent version of their career where they're getting all this really great work. So their idea
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
lifting
Yeah.
up the corner to reveal the inside is a critical theory idea. Bjarke Ingels is lifting up the corner to let the sunlight into a certain part of the building. But architecture today can
Right.
mostly be defined by the expert lifting up of corners for altruistic purposes.
I could talk about the. I literally could talk about this for another 2 or 3 hours. But I know you have a time limit. So, my last question is, and it's a little bit of a deviation from what we were just talking about. But you just finished this book, and this is research that you've been doing. As you said, basically your entire career. I'm kind of wondering what's next. Is there more to do around this subject? Do you have other research interests that you're focusing on? What's kind of the next thing that you're working on or thinking
I
about?
have this quality where I just like I I can't really start watching like series on HBO until there's like 8 or 10 episodes. Like I can't just watch like one episode of something. I can't
Yeah.
read a book unless there's already like five sequels, lined up.
Okay.
Like I'm just
Yeah, I could see this being a
there's some
problem.
aspect
Yeah.
of my personality that's just like really drawn to the long game. So I have students that are like, oh, I was reading about object oriented ontology. It's so like 2 years ago, and I'm like,
Yeah.
wait a minute, my education is in classical architecture, and that lasted, largely from 1421 until like let's say 1890 before things got started becoming Art Nouveau or modernist or whatever. So classical architecture was at least a 300-year, maybe 350-year project in architecture, and
Yeah.
it's not like I'm going to be like, oh, I did this thing in aesthetics, and now I'm going to do something on like I don't know, environmental
Right.
epistemology. Like I'm going to shift gears and do the next new thing. Like I've spent 20 years of my
Right.
life on this subject already, and I want to introduce it, and it may take. As I told you, the architectural community is set up to think in a certain way, and we all think we're being critical about our thought when the very idea of being critical of our thought is what's stopping us from thinking in new ways. So our
Right.
academies are set
Right.
up to pump out like people who are producing these narratives and alibis for architecture under the disguise of thinking that they're all producing like radical new work, when actually the very
Yeah.
apparatus of how we think about how we talk about students' work or how we expect them to present their work is actually what's locking us
Yeah.
into this way of actually doing really conservative, bad work that's bad for the world, in my opinion. So
Right. Yeah.
I think if there's a reintroduction of aesthetics into philosophy, so the title of the book is Aesthetics Equals Politics: New Discourses Across Art, Architecture, and Philosophy. So this isn't happening in one industry. I don't think this is a like find a I don't think this is like find a the next hot thing in any of these industries. I think if aesthetics is reintroduced into any and or all of these discourses, and we're talking to each other about the impacts of what this might be, that I don't know, maybe this is like a 10-year project, maybe it's a 100-year project, maybe it's another
Right.
400-year project. I don't really know, but it's what my expertise is in right now, and there's some interest in at least art, architecture, and philosophy, which are some pretty, I would think, uh, important industries to the world. Um, so I don't know. I don't think there's
Yeah.
like some new big
Okay.
revelation that comes after. But I will say that I edited this book and spent a lot of time with the material. But the book that I had done before this, I mean, I had done a monograph on my office before, but there's a book in between the two that's called Designing Social Equality, Architecture, Aesthetics, and the
Right.
Perception of Democracy. And that was thinking about how this aesthetic dimension operates in architecture politically. So it's taking all of
Right.
the stuff I learned in the first compendium of text that I did, all the stuff I learned editing this book, and thinking about what alternate models for not only architectural education would be, but the discipline and discourse of architecture. So if I kind of think about it like this: that architecture is used to changing styles. That we were doing
Hmm.
pointy, crazy, deconstructive things for a while, and then we were doing blobby, smooth, fluid Zaha Hadid things for a while, and now we're lifting corners and letting sunlight in because sustainability is important, and that the world is used to seeing architecture as changes in styles, and instead of thinking about just adding another style to that list and calling that innovation, my friends and I, who have been engaging this material, uh, are thinking about changing the operating system that architecture runs on. So
Hmm.
instead of introducing a new software program, like let's think about like completely changing the operating system of architecture at an intellectual level. So
Right.
it's not like what does the new thing look like? It's like how do these ideas like alter how we might even teach architecture, or how we might be
Yeah.
structured as a profession, or how we think about what we do enters and bounces around the world. So I think we're trying to change
Yeah.
the profession at a much more fundamental level than just a kind of stylistic way, which is so ironic because people associate architecture and aesthetics with only the stylistic way. We're thinking
Right.
about as
Right.
art aesthetics as the intellectual tool and discourse that is the can opener that allows us to reformat the profession, and it's very like academic and professional roots. So we're in the process of right now of like pulling up and replanting roots in different ways, and in different schools around the world that these people are active, and in different disciplines, even in art, architecture, and philosophy. But Graham Harman has told me how his philosophical ideas have influenced things like fish hatcheries. Like people
Oh,
are thinking that
interesting.
these
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
ideas are being propelled through cultures in different ways and having an impact. And that's exactly how aesthetics work. That ideas and objects bump around the world and have the capacity for change. And those changings are already taking place in the worlds of art, architecture, and philosophy. But maybe these ideas also bounce around the world and have additional influences in things like politics. And it's wishful
Right.
thinking to think that
Right.
my book on aesthetics is going to take down Trump, but really,
Fingers
fingers
crossed.
crossed. But the only thing that has changed the world is ideas, right? So
Right.
like,
Right.
so you can either hide your head in the sand, or you can introduce new ideas into whatever aspect of the world in which you operate, and hope that those ideas have positive social and cultural impact as they propagate through the world. But all I can really do is produce the idea and believe that the idea is just, and have thought about how it enters the world and thought about how it might operate justly and in terms of equality and the propagation of democracy, which is largely what my last book is about, that relationship between aesthetics and perception and democracy and equality. So anticipating how these ideas go through the world, and hoping, but you can't say like, with this
Yeah.
publication, I hereby bring down Donald Trump and dictators everywhere. But the only
Right,
thing that
right,
ever
right.
has been new ideas. So,
Yeah, yeah, I love that. It's such a great way to kind of wrap up this whole conversation. Also, I found the book so fascinating and challenging and interesting, and same for this conversation. It was nice to kind of talk out some of these ideas and hear a little bit more about kind of your approach and how you think about these things. So, thank you so much for being on the
my
podcast.
pleasure. It's been nice to speak about the book, but also like every time I do these kinds of talks, it makes me think about the material in the new way, which means, like in aesthetic
Good.
terms, that my own book is like bouncing around my own world and having different impacts. So it's like further
Yeah,
evidence of what's in the book is true by virtue of the very behavior of the book in my own life. So that's always kind of an
yeah,
interesting thing to
I
confront.
love that. I love that.
The book on aesthetics
Uh,
operating in the aesthetic dimension.
This episode was recorded on June 4th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcasts. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.